The iron poker struck flesh with a sound that made Gareth's stomach lurch. Through the narrow gap between timber houses, he watched Aldrich, the miller's wife, crumple against the stone hearth, her cry strangled into silence. Blood traced a thin line down her temple as she pressed herself smaller against the cold stones, arms wrapped around her swollen belly. "Please," Marta whispered, the word barely carried on the morning air. "The babe!" Aldrich's boot connected with her ribs. "Worthless sow! Can't even birth a son properly. 3 daughters, and now this wretch in your belly will likely be another girl." The cottage door stood wide open to the September morning, yet not one soul in Millbrook's Market Square turned toward the sounds of violence. Merchants hawked their bread and cheese with studied determination. Women drew water from the well with careful precision. Children chased chickens between the houses as if the world contained nothing more pressing than their games. All within sight of horror, all pretending blindness. Gareth Fitzwalter, 18 winters old and barely 3 months sworn to knighthood, felt his hand find his sword hilt without conscious thought. The familiar weight of steel should have brought comfort, but standing in this village square watching a pregnant woman beaten while her neighbors played deaf and blind, even his blessed blade felt inadequate against the weight of willful ignorance. "Mind your own affairs, young squire." The gravelly voice belonged to Brom the blacksmith, whose shoulders were broad enough to block out the morning sun. Coal dust streaked his leather apron, and his massive arms bore the scars of 20 years working red-hot iron. He positioned himself between Gareth and the miller's cottage, with the casual authority of a man who'd never lost a physical confrontation. "Squire," Gareth's voice cracked with indignation, "I earned my spurs fair, before God and witnesses. Sir Edmund himself placed them on my boots. And Sir Edmund ain't here to watch you make a fool's mistake." Brom spat into the dirt, the glob landing dangerously close to Gareth's polished boots. "Aldrich's in his rights. Church law grants a man dominion over his household. Holy Scripture itself commands wives to submit to their husbands." Another blow landed inside the cottage, followed by Marta's muffled sob. The sound cut through Gareth like a blade between ribs, sharper than any wound he'd taken in training. His mentor Sir Edmund had drilled the code of chivalry into him since childhood. Protect the innocent, defend those who cannot defend themselves. Let justice guide your sword arm, and mercy temper your heart. But standing here in Millbrook's dusty square, watching 20-odd villagers ignore a woman's agony, those noble words felt hollow as empty armor. "She's with child," Gareth said through gritted teeth. "Heavy with child, and he beats her like a man correcting his wife. 3 daughters she's given him, and each birth harder than the last. If this one's another girl," he shrugged massive shoulders, "can't blame a man for his frustration." "I can blame him for his fists." "Then you're a fool." The blacksmith stepped closer, using his considerable height to loom over the young knight. "You think your pretty spurs give you the right to interfere in matters that been settled since Adam and Eve? Aldrich bought that girl fair from her father, paid good silver for her, stood before the priest, spoke the vows proper. What passes between husband and wife ain't no business of yours." Inside the cottage, furniture crashed, wood splintered. Marta's voice rose in a wail of pure terror before cutting off abruptly, as if a hand had covered her mouth. Gareth's sword sang free from its scabbard, with a sound like ringing bells. The bright steel caught the summer sun, casting dancing reflections across the packed earth of the market square. Conversations died. Children stopped their games. Every eye in Millbrook turned toward the young knight standing with drawn blade and blazing eyes. "I said, mind your affairs, boy." Brom's voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "Sir Edmund won't protect you from the consequences of this folly. Lord Aldwyn neither.
You draw steel on a good Christian man in his own home, you'll answer for it in blood and gold." "Then I'll answer." Gareth was surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. The sword felt light in his grip, eager almost, as if the blade itself thirsted for justice. "Stand aside, blacksmith." For a long moment they faced each other in the growing crowd. Braham's hands were empty, but dangerous. Those arms could crush a man's ribs like kindling. Forge-hardened fingers could snap necks with casual ease. Around them, the villagers pressed closer, their faces showing everything from excitement to horror. Violence was coming to Millbrook, and none of them wanted to miss the show. Then Braham's expression shifted, calculation replacing bluster. He'd seen something in Gareth's eyes, some measure of resolve that convinced him the young knight would use that blade if pushed. After a heartbeat that felt like an hour, he stepped back. "On your head be it, Sir Knight." The title dripped with mockery. Remember this moment when Lord Aldwin's asking why one of his sworn men murdered a village miller over a domestic squabble. Gareth strode toward the cottage, his footsteps ringing against the cobbled path like war drums. Each step brought fresh sounds of violence, Aldrich's harsh breathing, Marta's whimpered pleas, the meaty sound of flesh striking flesh. By the time he reached the doorway, his jaw ached from clenching so hard. The cottage was larger than most in Millbrook, befitting the miller's important position in the community's economy. Sacks of grain lined the walls, and the air was thick with flour dust that sparkled in the morning light streaming through small windows. A loft above held stores of wheat and barley, while the main room served as both living space and business office. Aldrich stood in the center of this domestic kingdom like a bloated king, the iron poker gripped in his meaty fist. He was built like the ox that turned his millstone, broad shoulders, thick neck, arms that could hoist 100-pound sacks of grain without strain. Sweat darkened his coarse hair, and his face was flushed with exertion and what smelled like morning ale. At his feet, Marta lay curled against the stone hearth like a broken doll. Her dark hair, once lustrous according to village gossip, hung lank and matted with blood. The simple woolen dress she wore was torn at the shoulder, and the way she held her left arm suggested injury beyond the visible bruises. But it was her belly that drew Gareth's eye. Swollen with late pregnancy, vulnerable as an egg beneath her protective arms. She'd been the cooper's daughter once, before her father's debts forced the marriage contract. A dowry of 3 silver coins and a promise to forgive the cooper's obligations. A bargain that sealed a young woman's fate to a man twice her age with fists like hammers. "Aldrich the miller," Gareth called, his voice carrying the authority Sir Edmund had taught him to project. "I would have words with you." The older man turned slowly, like a bear disturbed at his feeding. His small eyes fixed on Gareth's drawn sword, then moved to his face with lazy contempt. When he smiled, it revealed teeth stained brown with ale and neglect. "Sir Knight," Aldrich said, offering a mocking bow that barely inclined his massive frame. "What brings you to my humble dwelling? Surely not concern for domestic matters that ain't your business?" "Any matter of justice is my business." Gareth stepped across the threshold, hyper-aware of the crowd gathering behind him. Half of Millbrook was pressed against the doorway now, eager to witness whatever came next. "Stand away from the woman." "The woman?" Aldrich's laugh was harsh as grinding stone. "This is my wife, bought and blessed before God and witnesses. Cost me 3 silver pieces and a promise to forgive her father's debts. I'll discipline her as I see fit. You'll do no such thing while I draw breath."
"Won't I?" The miller hefted the poker like a weapon, its iron length darkened with soot and what might have been blood. "And what gives a beardless boy the right to interfere between man and wife? You ain't even wed yourself, are you, Sir Knight? What do you know of the burdens of marriage?" The question stung because it held truth. Gareth had never taken a wife, barely knew women beyond his sister and the serving girls at Sir Edmund's manor. His understanding of marriage came from songs and stories, idealized visions of courtly love and chivalric devotion. Standing here, facing the brutal reality of a union founded on commerce rather than affection, he felt his inexperience like a weight around his neck. But Marta's ragged breathing reminded him that inexperience didn't excuse inaction. "I know enough to recognize cruelty when I see it," he said steadily. "Set down your weapon and step back." "Weapon? This old poker? I was merely stirring my fire when you burst in making wild accusations." He gestured toward the cold hearth with its pile of unburned logs. "Though I suppose a young knight eager for glory might mistake any household implement for a threat." The bastard was clever, Gareth realized with growing horror. Playing to his audience, making it seem as though the violence was imagined, the poker innocent, the confrontation manufactured by an over-eager young knight seeking drama where none existed. "I saw you strike her," Gareth said, his voice tight with frustration. "Did you? From where? Peering through my window like some common spy? How very unchivalrous. A true knight announces himself proper, doesn't lurk about watching honest folk go about their business." Several villagers nodded at this, murmuring agreement. Already the story was changing in their minds, the violent husband becoming the wronged party, the young knight transformed into an interloper seeking conflict where none existed. "She bears fresh bruises," Gareth gestured toward Marta with his free hand. "Aye, from her clumsiness. Pregnant women are unsteady on their feet, everyone knows that. Ask anyone in this village, Marta has always been prone to accidents. Haven't you, wife?" All eyes turned to the woman crouched by the cold hearth. Blood had dried at her temple in a dark rivulet, and her torn dress revealed purple bruises along her collarbone. But her expression was carefully neutral, her gaze fixed on the packed earth floor as if she could will herself invisible. The silence stretched like a bowstring under tension. Around the doorway, villagers leaned forward, hungry for her response. Would she confirm her husband's lie or risk his increased fury by speaking truth? I fell. My husband speaks true. I am clumsy with child." The words hit Gareth like stones thrown at close range. She was protecting her tormentor, giving him the lie he needed to escape justice. And why wouldn't she? Gareth would ride away by evening, returning to Sir Edmund's warm manor and full belly. But she would remain here, with Aldric's fists and his mounting rage at being humiliated before the village. "See?" Aldric spread his hands wide, the picture of wounded innocence. His voice carried to every ear pressed against the doorway. "My wife confirms it. A simple household accident magnified in this young knight's imagination into some grand drama. Now, Sir Gareth, I suggest you sheath your blade before this misunderstanding grows beyond repair." The poker remained in Aldric's grip, and his stance suggested readiness to use it. Around the doorway, the crowd murmured with growing confidence that they'd witnessed a young fool's mistake rather than any real injustice. Public opinion was shifting like sand, flowing away from Gareth with each passing moment.
His sword trembled in his grip, the bright steel wavering between duty and discretion. Everything in him screamed to act, to cut this monster down where he stood and damn the consequences. The code demanded it. Justice required it, but surrounded by witnesses ready to swear he'd attacked an innocent man, with the victim herself denying the truth of her own suffering. "Gareth." The voice came from behind him, cutting through the crowd's murmur like a blade through cloth. Sir Edmund Blackwood stood in the cottage doorway, his weathered face grave beneath iron-gray hair. At 45, he moved with the careful precision of a man who'd survived countless battles through skill rather than luck. His blue eyes took in the scene with the sharp assessment of someone who'd spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of feudal politics. "Sir Edmund." Aldric bowed with oily satisfaction, though he kept the poker within easy reach. Your young knight seems confused about the proper boundaries of chivalric intervention. I trust you'll educate him before he embarrasses himself further." Sir Edmund, gaze moved slowly from Gareth's drawn sword to Marta's huddled form to the poker in Aldric's grip. Those keen eyes missed nothing. Not the fresh blood on Marta's temple, not the way she held her injured arm, not the calculating gleam behind Aldric's mask of righteous indignation. "Indeed," Sir Edmund said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Gareth, sheathe your blade." The command struck like a physical blow. Gareth's head snapped toward his mentor, disbelief warring with ingrained obedience. "Sir Edmund, she is not your concern in this matter." The older knight's tone brooked no argument, each word falling like the blade of an executioner's axe. "The sword, Gareth, now." Defeat tasted like copper and ashes. Around the doorway, villagers whispered among themselves with the satisfied air of people who'd witnessed justice properly served. The young fool had been put in his place by their betters, order restored to their small world. Gareth slammed his sword home with unnecessary force, the blade ringing against the scabbard's mouth like a funeral bell. His face burned with shame and frustrated rage, but Sir Edmund's presence left no room for argument or explanation. "Wise counsel," Aldrich said, setting the poker aside with elaborate care. "Perhaps next time your boy will think twice before—" "Aldrich." Sir Edmund's voice cut through the miller's words like a blade through rotten wood. "I would have private words with you." Something in that tone made Aldrich's swagger falter. He glanced at the watching crowd, then back to Sir Edmund's impassive expression, searching for some hint of the older knight's intentions. "Of course, Sir Knight, though I'm not sure what requires privacy about such a simple misunderstanding." Outside, away from curious ears. The command left no room for negotiation. Aldrich's face showed a flicker of uncertainty before resuming its mask of injured dignity. "As you wish." The two men stepped from the cottage into the morning sunlight, their voices dropping to conversational levels that wouldn't carry to the eager crowd. Gareth caught fragments, Sir Edmund's measured tones and Aldrich's increasingly defensive responses, but the words remained tantalizingly unclear. Left alone in the cottage's dim interior, Gareth found himself facing Marta across a silence that felt heavier than stone. She remained crouched by the cold hearth, one hand pressed to her swollen belly, the other tentatively exploring the cut on her temple. Her dark eyes met his briefly before darting away like frightened sparrows. "Why?" The word escaped his lips before conscious thought could stop it. She was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Outside, Sir Edmund's voice rose slightly, though the words remained indistinct. When Marta finally spoke, her voice was barely higher than a whisper. "You don't understand. You'll ride away from here come evening, back to your lord's warm hall and your place at the high table. I remain. And if Aldrich thinks I encouraged your interference, if he believes I spoke against him to a knight," her hand tightened protectively over her unborn child, "the beating you witnessed would seem gentler by comparison." Understanding crashed over Gareth like ice water from a mountain stream. She wasn't protecting Aldrich. She was protecting herself and her child from the increased violence that would surely follow any perceived betrayal. In trying to rescue her, he'd only made her position more precarious. Outside, the conversation between the two older men had ended. Sir Edmund's boots rang against the cobblestones as he approached the cottage, his expression revealing nothing of what had passed between him and the miller. Gareth, Sir Edmund's voice cut through the cottage's oppressive atmosphere. We ride, immediately. There was nothing for it but obedience. As they mounted their horses in the village square, Gareth caught one last glimpse of Marta through the cottage window. A pale face framed by tangled dark hair, watching their departure with unreadable eyes.
They rode in absolute silence until Millbrook was lost behind the gentle fold of wooded hills that cradled the valley. Only then did Sir Edmund rein in his destrier beside a clear stream that chuckled over smooth stones. The older knight dismounted with practiced ease, leading his horse to drink, while Gareth remained frozen in his saddle like a statue carved from shame and frustration. "Dismount," Sir Edmund commanded quietly. "Water your horse. We have matters to discuss that cannot wait for castle walls." The stream ran clear and cold, fed by springs high in the surrounding hills. Ancient oaks overhung the water, their leaves just beginning to show the gold and crimson that would soon paint the entire valley in autumn's glory. It should have been a peaceful scene, the kind of spot where traveling knights might rest and refresh themselves without care. But peace felt as distant as the stars above. Gareth knelt beside the water, cupping the stream in his palms and drinking deeply. The cold liquid did nothing to wash away the bitter taste of failure. And when he looked up, he found Sir Edmund studying him with those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. "Do you think me a coward?" the older knight asked quietly. The question caught Gareth completely off guard. He nearly choked on the water, sputtering as he tried to form an answer that wouldn't compound his morning's disasters. "Sir Edmund? Never. You're the bravest man I know. But why did you stop me? She needed protection, and I—" "You offered destruction disguised as salvation." Sir Edmund settled himself on a fallen log, his movements betraying the subtle stiffness that came with decades of wearing armor and swinging heavy swords. "Tell me, what would have happened if you'd cut Uldric down in his own cottage?" "Justice would have been served." "Would it?" The older knight's expression remained neutral, but something in his tone suggested deep disappointment. "You'd have killed a man before a dozen witnesses in his own home over what they all swore was a simple accident. What then?" I opened his mouth to reply, then closed it as the implications began to unfold in his mind like a master strategist drawn a tactical map. Lord Aldwyn would have to answer for his knight's actions. Indeed, and what could he do, faced with such clear evidence of murder? You struck down an unarmed miller in his own home before his pregnant wife, with numerous witnesses swearing the man had done no wrong. He picked up a smooth stone from the stream bank, turning it over in his weathered hands like a merchant examining a questionable coin. He'd have no choice but to strip your spurs and deliver you to the king's justice, which means— "The gallows?" The word came out as barely a whisper, carrying with it the weight of absolute finality. "The gallows! And what of Marta, then? A widow heavy with child, her husband dead by your hand, his blood money from the grain trade vanished with his life. No family to take her in. Her father's poverty was what forced the marriage in the first place. No dowry to attract another husband. And now the added burden of being known as the woman whose knight protector became her husband's killer." Each word hit like a physical blow, driving the air out of his lungs and replacing it with the cold weight of understanding. He sank down beside the stream, his head in his hands, as the full scope of his near catastrophe became clear. She'd be destitute, probably dead before winter, and her children with her. Almost certainly. The other villagers would shun her, fearing association with someone touched by such violence.
The church might refuse her charity, seeing her as complicit in her husband's death. Her daughters would grow up as outcasts, unmarriageable, likely forced into beggary or worse. Sir Edmund's voice was relentless, each word hammering home the consequences that Gareth's righteous fury could have unleashed. You'd have destroyed the very person you sought to protect and died uselessly in the bargain. Then what should I have done? Stand by and watch while he beat her bloody? You should have done exactly what you did, drawn attention to the situation, made it known that someone was watching, someone who cared about justice, but with wisdom rather than steel. There are more ways to protect the innocent than with sword point, Gareth. Sometimes the subtler path serves better than the dramatic one.
They sat in contemplative silence while their horses drank their fill and cropped the sweet grass that grew beside the stream. A hawk circled high overhead, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace, and watching it, Gareth felt a stab of envy for the simple clarity of the bird's existence. Hunt, eat, survive. No moral complexities, no codes of honor that demanded impossible choices. "What did you say to him?" Gareth asked finally. "To Aldrich, I mean. What words could possibly make a man like that change his ways?" Sir Edmund's expression grew thoughtful, like a chess master contemplating his next several moves. "I explained certain realities that perhaps hadn't occurred to him previously. How unfortunate accidents sometimes befall men who draw unwanted attention to their households. How millers depend entirely on Lord Aldwin's goodwill for their livelihood, the grain that turns his wheel, the right to collect tolls from those who use his services, the protection of law that keeps bandits from burning his property. You threatened his livelihood. I mentioned possibilities, economic realities, the fragile nature of prosperity in a world where lords have long memories and short patience for subjects who cause them embarrassment." The older knight's smile was thin as a blade's edge. "I also observed how young knights sometimes develop particular concerns for the welfare of pregnant women in outlying villages, especially when those women seem unusually prone to domestic accidents." Understanding began to dawn like sunrise after a long night of storm and darkness. "You told him I'd be back. I suggested that your chivalric nature might compel more regular visits to ensure the continued health and safety of Millbrook's expectant mothers, purely from a sense of knightly duty, of course. Such knights have been known to patrol their routes more frequently than strictly necessary, arriving at unexpected times to check on those under their protection." It wasn't the clean confrontation Gareth had envisioned, not the satisfying clash of steel on steel that filled the songs sung in great halls, but it was something more valuable. A web of pressure and consequences that left Aldrich knowing he was watched, that his actions had notice, that there would be a price for continued brutality. Will it work? For a time. Men like Aldrich understand threats to their comfort better than appeals to their conscience. The knowledge that you might return unannounced, that his treatment of his wife could affect his standing in the community, his relationship with Lord Aldwin. Sir Edmund shrugged. "It's not perfect justice, but it's protection that works within existing law and custom." "It feels like compromise with evil." "It is compromise with evil. That's the burden we bear, Gareth, knowing that perfect justice exists only in songs and stories told by firelight. In the real world, we work within the constraints we're given. Save who we can save, protect who we can protect, and pray it's enough to tip the balance toward righteousness. So we choose the lesser evil when greater good isn't possible. We choose what works, what actually protects people, rather than satisfying our need to feel heroic. Sir Edmund moved toward his horse, checking the animal's hooves and tack with the automatic precision of a man who'd learned that small details could mean the difference between life and death. The code of chivalry isn't about grand gestures and dramatic confrontations, despite what the troubadours sing. It's about service, quiet, persistent, often thankless service to those who cannot protect themselves.
They remounted and rode deeper into Lord Aldwin's domain as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western hills. The road wound through forests of oak and beech, past fields where peasants worked the late harvest under the watchful eyes of their lord's bailiffs. It was a prosperous land, well managed and carefully protected, the kind of realm that produced wealth enough to support knights and castles and all the elaborate structures of feudal society. Yet even here, Gareth now understood, prosperity came at a cost measured in compromises and accommodations with injustice. "Tell me about your first real test," he said, as they crested a hill that offered a view of Castle Aldwin in the distance. "The first time you faced the choice between what felt right and what was wise." Sir Edmund was quiet for so long that Gareth began to think the older knight wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old regrets and hard-won wisdom. "I was perhaps a year older than you are now, newly knighted, full of righteous fire, convinced that my sword could carve justice from an unjust world. My lord, Sir William the Bold, may God rest his soul, sent me to collect taxes from a village much like Millbrook." He paused, his weathered hands resting easily on his reins while his destrier picked its way carefully down the hillside path. "The reeve was a cruel man named Godwin, who took pleasure in squeezing every copper from families that could barely afford bread. When I arrived, I found him preparing to seize a widow's only cow because she couldn't pay the full tithe after her husband died of fever. What did you do? What you would have done, I suspect. I drew my sword, declared that justice demanded mercy, and ordered him to leave the woman in peace." Sir Edmund's laugh was bitter as wormwood wine. "Godwin backed down, of course. What choice did a village reeve have against a knight? I felt magnificent, convinced I'd struck a blow for righteousness that would echo through the halls of heaven. But Godwin was accountable to Sir William for every penny of tax revenue. When he returned short, he had to explain why. So he told the truth, that Sir Edmund's knight had prevented him from collecting lawful dues, threatening violence if he performed his sworn duty." Gareth winced, already seeing where the tale was leading, like a man watching an archer draw his bow toward a target. "Sir William was furious, and rightly so. I'd undermined his authority, interfered with legal tax collection, and put him in the position of appearing weak before his own reeve. He had 3 choices: punish me severely, punish the reeve for failing his duties, or find some other solution that preserved everyone's honor while recovering the lost revenue. What did he choose? He doubled the village's taxes the following season to make up for the shortfall, then assigned me to collect them personally so I could see the consequences of my dramatic gesture." Sir Edmund's voice grew heavy with the weight of old regret. "The widow lost her cow anyway, along with her cottage when she couldn't pay the increased assessment. 3 other families were forced to sell children into service to meet their obligations. My moment of chivalric glory ultimately caused far more suffering than it prevented."
The stars seemed dimmer suddenly, their light inadequate against the weight of such hard-won wisdom. Gareth found himself thinking of all the ways his intervention in Millbrook might have backfired, all the unintended consequences that his righteous anger could have unleashed like wildfire in a dry forest. "How do you live with such knowledge?" he asked quietly. "By learning from it, by understanding that good intentions without wisdom are often more dangerous than malice with limits." Sir Edmund finished adjusting his horse's bridle and swung back into the saddle with the fluid motion of long practice. "And by accepting that sometimes the best we can do is incrementally better, not perfectly right." Is that enough? Incremental improvement while people suffer? It has to be enough, because it's all we have. The perfect justice you crave exists only in the world beyond this one. Here we work within human limitations, political realities, and social structures that have evolved over centuries. Change them too quickly or too dramatically, and you often destroy more than you save. A nightbird called from the forest beyond the road, its cry echoing off the hillsides before fading into the growing darkness. The sound seemed to emphasize the vast complexity of the world surrounding them, the immensity of suffering that no single sword could cure and no individual act of heroism could remedy. "So we compromise with evil," Gareth said, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "We choose the lesser evil when greater good isn't possible. We save who we can save, protect who we can protect, and trust that small victories accumulate into something meaningful over time." Sir Edmund urged his horse forward at a steady walk. "Tomorrow I'll show you the patrol routes I think would best serve Millbrook's needs. Monthly visits, unannounced timing, with particular attention to the welfare of pregnant women and families under unusual stress." "And you think that will be enough to protect Marta?" "I think it will make her safer than she was yesterday. And sometimes, Gareth, that's the most any of us can achieve, making tomorrow incrementally better than today, one small choice at a time." They rode on toward the castle as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Gareth uncomfortably of blood and fire. Behind them, Millbrook was settling into evening routines, cooking fires being lit, animals brought in from pasture, children called home from their games. And in the miller's cottage, Aldrich would be contemplating the changed circumstances of his life, knowing that his actions now carried consequences beyond his own threshold. It wasn't the victory Gareth had dreamed of when he'd first drawn his sword that morning. But perhaps it was something better. Practical protection that might actually keep Marta and her unborn child safe. The code of chivalry he was beginning to understand lived not in grand gestures and dramatic confrontations, but in the patient, careful application of power in service to those who had none. As they approached the castle gates, Sir Edmund's voice carried clearly in the still evening air. "Sleep well tonight, Gareth. Tomorrow begins the real work of knighthood, not the dramatic gestures that make for good songs, but the quiet, persistent effort to make the world incrementally more just. It's harder than the troubadours suggest, but infinitely more important." The gates of Castle Aldwyn rose before them, and beyond lay a lifetime of service to ideals that proved more nuanced with each passing day. But for the first time since earning his spurs, Gareth felt he was beginning to understand what it truly meant to be a knight.
3 weeks passed before Gareth returned to Millbrook, and the interval had done nothing to ease the weight that had settled in his chest since that September morning. He'd thrown himself into his duties at Castle Aldwyn with the desperate energy of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts, training with sword and lance until his muscles screamed, studying maps and supply ledgers until his eyes burned, volunteering for every patrol and assignment Sir Edmund would allow. But none of it could banish the image of Marta's pale face or the sound of her whispered submission to her husband's lies. The October morning was crisp and clear when you rode alone into the village square, the destrier's hooves ringing against cobblestones still slick with morning frost. He'd planned this visit carefully, timing his arrival for market day, when the square would be busy with commerce and his presence might seem routine rather than suspicious. The scene that greeted him was both familiar and subtly different. The same merchants hawked their wares, the same children played between the stalls, the same dogs scavenged for scraps beneath the tables. But there was something in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before, a quality of watchfulness that made conversations die as he approached and resume only after he'd passed. He dismounted near the well, ostensibly to water his horse, while actually positioning himself where he could observe the miller's cottage without seeming to do so. The doors stood open as before, but no sounds of violence emerged from within. Instead, he could hear the normal rhythms of domestic life, the scrape of a wooden spoon against a pot, the soft murmur of women's voices, the contented gurgling of an infant. Sir Knight, the voice belonged to Genna, the baker's wife, a round-faced woman whose flour-dusted apron and worried expression marked her as someone with something urgent to communicate. She approached with the careful steps of someone unsure whether her words would be welcome. "Goodwife Genna," Gareth replied with a respectful nod. "How fares Millbrook this fine morning?" "Well enough, my lord, well enough, though—" She glanced around nervously as if the very walls might have ears. "Might I have a word, privately?" They walked to the edge of the square where a small shrine to St. Christopher offered some shelter from curious eyes and ears. Genna clutched her shawl tightly about her shoulders, her weathered hands betraying the tremor of someone carrying news too heavy for comfortable bearing. "It's about Marta, my lord, the miller's wife." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She birthed her babe 2 weeks past, a son, healthy and strong, praise God." Relief flooded through Gareth like warm wine. "And she? How does she fare?" "Better than she has in months, if I'm honest." Genna's expression was complicated, mixing relief with something that might have been puzzlement. "Aldrich, he's changed since your last visit, my lord. Changed considerable." "In what manner?" "He's gentle with her now, brings her ale himself rather than demanding she fetch it. Hired my youngest daughter to help with the household work so Marta can rest proper with the new babe. Haven't heard so much as a raised voice from that cottage since—" She paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Since that morning you spoke with him." The transformation seemed almost too good to believe. Could fear alone have wrought such a transformation? Or was this merely a temporary performance, a show put on for the benefit of watching neighbors until the knight's attention moved elsewhere?
He spent the morning making his presence felt throughout the village, inspecting the bridge for needed repairs, checking with the reeve about tax collection, discussing the upcoming harvest with various farmers. Normal activities that established legitimate reasons for his visit while keeping him visible to anyone who might be watching. It was near midday when he finally approached the miller's cottage directly. The sound of infant crying had drawn him, and as he neared the open door, he could hear Marta's voice singing a soft lullaby in the dim interior. "Goodwife Marta?" he called from the threshold, not wanting to startle her by entering unannounced. "Sir Knight!" Her voice carried genuine surprise rather than fear. "Please, enter. You honor our humble home." The cottage's interior had been transformed as dramatically as its inhabitants. Where before the air had been thick with tension and the threat of violence, now it felt warm and domestic. Clean rushes covered the floor, and the hearth burned with a cheerful fire that filled the space with golden light. Sacks of grain were neatly arranged, tools properly stored, and the whole room spoke of care and attention to domestic comfort. Marta sat in a wooden chair near the fire, cradling a bundle of swaddling cloths that could only be her newborn son. The change in her appearance was remarkable. Her dark hair was clean and neatly braided, her face had filled out with proper nutrition, and most importantly, the terrible wariness that had marked her previous demeanor was replaced by something approaching peace. "Your son?" Gareth asked, gesturing toward the bundle in her arms. "Aye, my lord. Born healthy and whole, God be praised. We've named him Edmund, if that pleases you." The implication struck him like a physical blow. They'd named their child after his mentor, the man whose wisdom had found a way to protect where Gareth's passion would have destroyed. "It pleases me greatly. Sir Edmund will be honored to know of it." "And Aldrich, how does he fare as a father?" "Changed, my lord. Changed as if touched by the Almighty himself." Her voice held wonder, as if she still couldn't quite believe the transformation she'd witnessed. "He holds little Edmund for hours, singing to him, making faces to coax smiles. Says he's determined this one will know only gentleness from his father's hand." Before Gareth could respond, heavy footsteps announced Aldrich's return from the mill. The big man filled the doorway, flour dust coating his clothes and arms, but his expression was entirely different from that September morning, where before there had been brutish anger and casual cruelty. Now there was something approaching humility. "Sir Knight," he said, offering a bow that seemed genuinely respectful rather than mocking, "welcome to our home. I trust you find all well here?" "Very well indeed," Gareth replied carefully. "Your wife tells me you've been blessed with a son." "Aye, and praise God for it. A perfect child, healthy and strong. Marta endured the birth like a true knight might endure battle, with courage and honor." He looked at his wife with an expression Gareth would never have expected to see from him. "I've been reflecting much on what manner of man I wish to be, what manner of father." "Reflection is the beginning of wisdom," Gareth observed neutrally. "And I've had cause for much reflection since our last conversation. A man realizes how fragile his blessings truly are, how much depends on the goodwill of others, how quickly comfort can become hardship if one forgets his place in the order of things."
The months that followed brought a routine of unannounced visits that became as natural as the changing seasons. Gareth found reasons to patrol through Millbrook regularly, checking road conditions, investigating reports of bandit activity, ensuring tax collection proceeded smoothly. Always legitimate business, but conducted with the careful attention of a man who understood that prevention was worth more than any cure. Each visit revealed further evidence of the transformation in Aldrich's household. The miller had become something of a model husband and father, his treatment of Marta gentle to the point where neighboring wives began to comment enviously on her good fortune. Little Edmund thrived under the care of both parents, growing into a robust child whose laughter could be heard throughout the village. But it was during the harsh January visit that Gareth truly understood the depth of the change that had taken place. He arrived in the midst of a winter storm, seeking shelter as much as conducting business. The village was locked in ice and snow, with most families huddled around their fires waiting for the weather to break. When he knocked on the miller's door, it was Aldrich himself who answered, his face showing genuine concern for a traveler caught in dangerous conditions. "Sir Knight, come in, come in! No man should be abroad in such weather." The big miller ushered him inside, helping him remove his ice-crusted cloak. "Marta, set another bowl. Sir Gareth will sup with us tonight." The cottage was warm and inviting, filled with the rich scents of stew and fresh bread. Marta moved about the kitchen with easy confidence, no longer the cowering victim he'd first encountered, but a woman secure in her place and role. Little Edmund, now 4 months old, lay in a wooden cradle near the fire, gurgling contentedly at the dancing shadows. As they shared the evening meal, Gareth observed the family dynamics with the careful attention he'd learned to bring to all such situations. Aldrich spoke to his wife with respect, asked her opinions on household matters, praised her cooking with genuine appreciation. When Edmund began to fuss, both parents responded immediately, Aldrich just as quick to soothe the child as Marta was. "You've built something good here," Gareth observed as they lingered over cups of mulled ale. "Aye, by God's grace, though I'll not claim I always understood the value of what I had. Sometimes a man needs guidance to see his blessings clearly, and sometimes that guidance comes from unexpected sources. True words, Sir Knight. Very true words indeed." Aldrich's gaze met his directly. "I've learned that a man's reputation travels farther than he might think, that actions have consequences beyond his own threshold, that the respect of good men must be earned and can be lost more quickly than it was gained."
Later that night, as Gareth settled into the guest pallet they'd prepared for him, he found himself contemplating the strange turns that life could take. His dramatic gesture in September had nearly brought disaster to everyone involved, but Sir Edmund's subtler approach, the carefully applied pressure, the implied consequences, the knowledge that actions were being watched and judged, had accomplished what direct confrontation could never have achieved. The transformation wasn't perfect, and Gareth harbored no illusions that it would last forever without continued vigilance. Men like Aldrich didn't change their fundamental nature overnight, but fear of consequences had modified behavior, and modified behavior had created new habits, and those habits had gradually become something approaching genuine care for his family. It was a fragile peace, dependent on continued oversight and the ever-present knowledge that someone was watching, but it was real peace nonetheless. And in the warmth of that cottage, listening to the contented breathing of a family sleeping safely, Gareth felt something he hadn't expected, a deep satisfaction in work well done. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having blown itself out during the night. As Gareth prepared to continue his patrol, Marta approached him with a package wrapped in clean linen. "Bread and cheese for your journey, my lord," she said quietly. "And my thanks for everything. I did very little. You did what needed doing, not what felt heroic or satisfying, but what actually helped." Her smile was warm with genuine gratitude. "Edmund will grow up knowing his father as a gentleman. My daughters speak of him with respect rather than fear. That's worth more than all the grand gestures in the world." As he rode away from Millbrook that morning, Gareth carried with him a deeper understanding of what knighthood truly meant. The song spoke of dramatic battles and heroic rescues, of evil vanquished by righteous swords and justice served through strength of arms. Those stories had their place. The world needed heroes willing to face monsters with steel and fire. But the world also needed knights willing to do the harder work of slow change, patient pressure, and careful attention to consequences. It needed men who understood that sometimes the greatest victories were the quiet ones, measured not in enemies slain, but in families protected. Not in dramatic confrontations, but in the subtle shifts that made tomorrow safer than today. The code of chivalry lived in both kinds of service. But for knights like Gareth, charged with protecting the innocent in a complex world of law and custom, the subtler path would always be the more important one. Years later, when young knights asked him about the nature of true service, he would tell them about a September morning in Millbrook and how the greatest rescue of his career was accomplished not with sword work, but with patience, wisdom, and the understanding that real protection sometimes looked nothing like the song suggested. Some listened, some learned, and in villages throughout the realm, families slept safer because of it.